They told her to stand down. Direct order from command: do not engage. 520 soldiers pinned in the valley below. Ammunition running dry. Medics scrambling between wounded men who screamed into radios that no one was answering. And she watched it all happen through her scope, finger resting beside the trigger, while her spotter kept repeating the same 3 words: "We have orders." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But Lieutenant Kiera Halstead didn't pull back. She stayed on that ridge, scanning, calculating, watching something that made every instinct in her body scream that command had it wrong. And when she finally squeezed that trigger, defying protocol, ignoring rank, breaking every rule in the military handbook, the entire battalion below her stopped dying. Want to know what a single sniper saw that an entire command center missed? Want to know why 520 men owe their lives to a woman who was supposed to retreat and let them become statistics? Then drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button, because this isn't just about following orders. It's about knowing when the right choice means breaking every rule you've ever been taught. The Kandara Valley wasn't supposed to be hostile territory anymore. That's what the briefing said. That's what intelligence reports confirmed. 3 weeks of satellite surveillance, drone reconnaissance, local informant networks, all of it pointing to the same conclusion. The valley was clear. The operation was green-lit. And Bravo Battalion, 520 strong, moved into position for what command called a routine defensive establishment. Routine. That word would haunt the after-action reports for years. Lieutenant Kiera Halstead had been a sniper for 6 years, but she'd been a hunter long before that. Grew up in the Montana wilderness, where her father taught her that animals don't just move, they move with purpose. Every step means something. Every pause tells a story. And when something feels wrong in the forest, you don't wait for proof. You trust the feeling, because by the time you have proof, you're already dead. She'd brought that instinct to the military. Earned her tab at Fort Benning, top of her class in long-range marksmanship. But what made her exceptional wasn't her aim. Plenty of soldiers could hit targets at 1,500 meters. What made her dangerous was that she read terrain like poetry, could see patterns in landscapes that other people missed, understood that warfare wasn't just about bullets and targets. It was about space, timing, and the tiny details that separated ambush from safety. Her spotter, Corporal Danny Reeves, had worked with her for 2 years. He trusted her judgment more than he trusted most officers. But even he was getting nervous as they watched Bravo Battalion move into the valley below. Command says we're supposed to maintain overwatch for 2 hours, then pull back to the forward operating base, Reeves said, adjusting his spotting scope. Weather's turning. We need to extract before the storm hits. Kiera didn't respond. She was watching the valley through her scope, tracking movement that wasn't there. That was the problem. The valley was too quiet, too empty, too perfectly arranged. The terrain told a story. A creek bed that wound through the center of the valley, providing natural cover. Rocky outcroppings on the eastern ridge that offered elevated positions. An abandoned village on the northern approach that intelligence had cleared as structurally unsound, not worth investigating. And scattered throughout, patches of vegetation that had grown wild after years of neglect. It all looked normal. Textbook defensive terrain. But something was wrong. You see anything? Reeves asked. I see what's not there, Kiera replied quietly. Bravo Battalion had established their perimeter. Defensive positions dug in. Heavy weapons teams setting up fields of fire. Command post erected near the center of the formation. Radio chatter was calm, professional. Everything by the book. That's when the valley exploded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not with bombs. Not with mortar. With coordinated small arms fire from positions that shouldn't have existed. The abandoned village wasn't empty, it was a fighting position with interlocking fields of fire. The rocky outcroppings on the eastern ridge weren't random terrain features, they were pre-positioned sniper nests. The vegetation patches weren't just overgrown wilderness, they concealed spider holes that had been prepared weeks in advance. Bravo Battalion was in a kill zone so perfectly constructed that it looked natural. Kiera watched through her scope as soldiers dove for cover that wasn't there. Watched as squad leaders tried to organize defensive fire while bullets came from every direction. Watched as the battalion surgeon set up a casualty collection point that immediately took fire from elevated positions. The radio frequencies exploded with traffic. Units calling for support. Medics screaming for evacuation. Company commanders trying to establish order while their soldiers died in carefully planned crossfire. And through it all, command kept broadcasting the same message. All sniper teams, pull back to FOB, weather moving in. Extract immediately. Do not engage without authorization. Reeves looked at Kiera. We have orders. She didn't move. Her eyes stayed pressed to her scope, tracking, calculating, reading the battlefield in a way that the commanders, 10 kilometers away, couldn't see on their digital displays, because Kiera saw something. Something that changed everything. The enemy fire wasn't random. It was orchestrated, coordinated by someone who understood not just tactics, but psychology. The shooting patterns were designed to push Bravo Battalion toward the creek bed, toward what looked like safety, but was actually the final stage of the trap, and she could see the commander. One man positioned on a ridge 800 meters from her location, directing the entire ambush with hand signals and radio commands. Take him out, and the coordinated fire would collapse into chaos. Leave him alive, and 520 soldiers would die in the next 30 minutes. But engaging meant disobeying direct orders, meant breaking protocol, meant potentially starting an international incident. If intelligence was wrong about who controlled this territory, Reeves saw her adjusting her scope. Kiera, command said. Command's watching satellites, she interrupted. I'm watching people die. Her finger moved to the trigger. Wind speed calculated. Distance confirmed. Elevation adjusted. The target was clear in her scope, a man in tactical gear directing an ambush that would become a massacre. If you take that shot, Reeves said quietly, your career is over. If I don't take it, Kiera replied. 520 families get folded flags. Want to know what happened when Lieutenant Kiera Halstead squeezed that trigger? Want to know why command tried to court-martial her before the soldiers she saved demanded she receive the Medal of Honor instead? Then stay with us, because what happened in the Kandara Valley that day didn't just save a battalion. It changed how the entire military thinks about protocol, authority, and the difference between following orders and doing what's right. We'll be right back after you hit that like button and drop a comment telling us. Have you ever had to choose between following the rules and doing what you knew was right? We read every comment, and your stories matter just as much as this one. The morning had started like any routine deployment operation. 430 hours. The sky still dark enough that stars burned clear and bright above forward operating base Sentinel. The air carried that particular desert cold that people who'd never served in mountain regions didn't expect. The kind that made your breath fog in your fingers. Stiff until the sun finally crested the peaks. Lieutenant Kiera Halstead moved through her pre-mission routine with the same methodical precision she'd practiced 1,000 times before. Check the rifle Barrett M82, chambered in .50 caliber, each component inspected and verified. Check the scope Leupold Mark IV, zeroed at the range 2 days prior. Elevation and windage turrets marked with her personal reference points. Check the ammunition match grade rounds, each one hand-selected for consistency, because at the distances she operated, a variance of a few grains meant the difference between a hit and a miss. Her hands moved without conscious thought. Magazine loaded, bolt cycled, chamber cleared, safety engaged. Ghillie suit components organized in her pack local vegetation, gathered the previous afternoon, color matched to the terrain they'd be operating in. Range finder, weather meter, notebook with wind charts and elevation tables, written in her own shorthand that only Reeves could decipher. The FOB Operations Center hummed with pre-dawn activity. Helicopter crews running pre-flight checks, their rotor blades ticking softly in the stillness. Infantry platoons gathering for final briefings. Young soldiers checking and rechecking gear with the nervous energy that came before every combat operation. The smell was familiar canvas and diesel fuel, gun oil and strong coffee. The particular scent of dust that seemed to coat everything in this region, no matter how often you cleaned. Corporal Danny Reeves appeared beside her, carrying his own pack and spotting scope. He was methodical too, but in a different way. Where Kiera moved with fluid economy, Reeves was deliberate, double-checking everything twice, because he'd learned early in his career that small mistakes became big problems when you were 10 kilometers from support. Weather forecast updated, he said, handing her a printout. Storm system moving faster than predicted. We've got maybe 6 hours of clear observation before visibility drops to nothing. Kiera studied the meteorological data. Wind speeds, cloud ceiling, precipitation probability. The numbers told a story just like terrain did. This operation had a narrow window. Before conditions made extraction complicated. Command still green lighting the movement? She asked. Bravo Battalion steps off at 0600. We insert 30 minutes prior. Establish overwatch position on Ridge 7-3. Standard reconnaissance and security protocol. Standard. That word again. Everything about this operation was being treated as routine, which should have been comforting. Should have meant that intelligence was solid. That risk assessment was favorable, that the soldiers moving into Kandara Valley would encounter nothing more dangerous than difficult terrain and uncomfortable weather. But Kiera had learned to be suspicious of the word standard. In her experience, the operations that got classified as routine were often the ones where people got complacent, where small details got overlooked because everyone assumed someone else had checked them. She'd grown up in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, daughter of a wilderness guide who taught her that nature didn't care about your plans. You could have the best equipment, the most detailed maps, the most experienced team, but if you missed the signs that a storm was building or a trail was unstable, all that preparation meant nothing. Her father had taught her to read landscapes the way most people read books, to understand that every feature of terrain existed for a reason, that rivers carved valleys following the path of least resistance, that vegetation grew differently on north-facing slopes versus south-facing, that animal trails always chose the most efficient routes through difficult country. When she'd joined the military at 19, she'd brought that understanding with her. Boot camp had been easy physical training she could handle, weapons qualification she excelled at, tactical instruction that made sense because it was just human behavior applied to combat situations. But it was sniper school where she'd found her calling, not because she enjoyed killing, she didn't, and anyone who said they did was lying or dangerous, but because long-range precision shooting required the same skills her father had taught her in the mountains. Reading wind by watching grass movement and dust patterns, judging distance by understanding how atmospheric conditions affected perception, calculating bullet trajectory by accounting for temperature, humidity, altitude, and a dozen other variables that changed constantly. Most importantly, it required patience. The ability to stay absolutely still for hours while watching, waiting, gathering information that would matter when the moment came to act. She'd been deployed to this region for 8 months. Long enough to understand the terrain, the weather patterns, the way local populations moved through the landscape. Long enough to develop instincts about what normal looked like and what didn't. The briefing for today's operation had been thorough. Bravo Battalion 520 soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Regiment would establish a defensive perimeter in Kandara Valley. The position would serve as a forward staging area for humanitarian operations in surrounding villages. Intelligence assessment: minimal threat. Local militia activity had decreased significantly over the past month. No credible reports of hostile forces in the region. Sniper teams would provide overwatch from elevated positions. Standard security protocol: observe, report, maintain communications with battalion command. Do not engage unless Bravo Battalion came under direct fire. Rules of engagement were restrictive. This was supposed to be a peacekeeping posture, not a combat operation. Kiera had studied the satellite imagery during the briefing. The valley was textbook terrain, open enough for good visibility, elevated positions for defensive advantage, natural water source running through the center. If you were teaching a class on defensive perimeter establishment, Kandara Valley would be the example you'd use, but something about the imagery had bothered her. She couldn't articulate it during the briefing, just a feeling that the terrain was too perfect, too ideally arranged, like someone had designed it specifically for the purpose it was about to serve. She'd kept that feeling to herself. Intelligence officers didn't appreciate snipers questioning their assessments based on vague intuitions. Command didn't change operational plans because a lieutenant had an uncomfortable feeling about satellite photos. At 0530, she and Reeves loaded into a Black Hawk helicopter with 3 other sniper teams. The bird lifted off smoothly, rising into the pre-dawn darkness while the foe shrank below them. The flight would take 20 minutes, following terrain masking routes to avoid potential observation. Kiera checked her gear one final time. Rifle secured, ammunition accessible, radio frequencies programmed. Reeves sat across from her, his expression calm but focused. They'd worked together long enough that words weren't always necessary. He knew she was processing something, working through calculations that went beyond the tactical briefing. The helicopter descended toward Ridge 7-3 as the eastern horizon began to glow with approaching sunrise. The insertion was smooth, fast rope deployment that put them on the ground in under 30 seconds. The Black Hawk lifted immediately, disappearing back toward the fob while the sound of its rotors faded into the distance. And then there was silence. The particular quality of quiet that existed in wild places before human activity filled the day. Kiera moved immediately toward their observation position, Reeves following 3 meters behind. Both of them scanning constantly for threats that intelligence said wouldn't be there. They reached the position as the sun broke over the peaks. The view was spectacular. Kandara Valley spread below them like a tactical map made real. She could see the routes Bravo Battalion would use to enter the valley, the locations where they'd establish defensive positions, the terrain features that would provide cover and concealment. She settled into position behind her rifle, adjusting the bipod, checking sight picture, confirming range estimates to key landmarks. Reeves sat up beside her with his spotting scope, notebook ready to record observations below them. Kandara Valley waited, empty, quiet, perfect. Too perfect. Kiera pressed her eye to her scope and began to scan. And as the morning light grew stronger, she started seeing things that the satellite imagery hadn't shown. Small details that didn't belong. Patterns in the landscape that told a story intelligence had missed completely. A story that was about to cost 520 soldiers their lives. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill and casting sharp shadows across Kandara Valley. Kiera continued her methodical scan of the terrain below, her scope moving in deliberate patterns left to right, near to far, studying every feature with the patience her father had taught her when tracking elk through mountain forests. Reeves, maintained his own observation through the spotting scope, occasionally making notes in his field book. Wind speed, temperature, visibility conditions. The standard data collection that snipers perform during overwatch operations. But he noticed that Kiera's scan pattern had changed. She was spending longer on specific areas, returning to certain spots repeatedly. Her breathing steady but her jaw tight in a way that meant she was working through something. "Talk to me," Reeves said quietly. "What are you seeing?" "I'm not sure yet," Kiera replied, not moving her eye from the scope. "Give me a few more minutes." In the valley below, Bravo Battalion had begun their movement. 520 soldiers moving in tactical formation, spread across multiple columns to minimize vulnerability. Company commanders coordinated over radio networks, maintaining spacing and interval as they approached their designated positions. It was textbook execution, exactly the kind of professional, military operation that looked impressive during training exercises and peacetime deployments. Captain Lucas Brennan commanded Bravo Battalion's lead company. He was 32 years old, West Point graduate, 2 previous deployments under his belt. He moved with his command element near the center of the formation, monitoring radio traffic and making small adjustments to keep his units aligned with the operational timeline. His platoon leaders were solid experienced sergeants who'd trained their soldiers well. First Lieutenant Amanda Cross led the forward platoon, her troops moving with disciplined caution despite the intelligence assessment that rated the area as low threat. Staff Sergeant Jerome Mitchell commanded the heavy weapons section, his gunners already identifying positions where they could establish interlocking fields of fire once the perimeter was established. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The kind of plan that got briefed at staff meetings and approved by commanders who studied terrain through digital displays and intelligence summaries. The kind of plan that looked perfect on paper because all the data suggested it should work exactly as designed. But Kiera wasn't looking at data. She was looking at dirt. 300 meters north of where Bravo Battalion's forward elements were advancing, there was an abandoned village. Intelligence had noted it in their assessment. 12 structures, mud brick construction, roofs partially collapsed. Population displaced 3 years ago during regional militia conflicts. Structural engineers had evaluated the satellite imagery and determined the buildings were unstable, potentially dangerous to occupy. The recommendation had been to avoid the village entirely, mark it as a hazard area, focus defensive positions on more reliable terrain. Kiera studied those buildings through her scope. The collapsed roofs, the crumbling walls, the empty doorways and broken windows that should have been filled with nothing but shadows and debris, except the shadows were wrong. She'd spent enough time in this region to know how light and shadow worked in these structures. Morning sun came from the east, which meant the western walls of those buildings should be fully illuminated while the interiors remained dark. Simple geometry, basic physics, but in 3 of those buildings, the shadows had depth that didn't match the angle of the sun. Darkness that seemed too uniform, too carefully arranged. And in one doorway, she saw something that made her finger unconsciously move closer to her trigger, a straight line, where there should have been irregular collapse. A geometric edge that nature didn't create randomly. "Reeves," she said quietly. "Glass me on the village. Northern structure, 3rd from the left. Tell me what you see in that doorway." Reeves shifted his spotting scope, adjusting magnification and focus. He studied the building for 30 seconds, then another 30. His breathing changed slightly, the subtle shift that happened when you saw something that contradicted your expectations. "That's not structural collapse," he said. "That's constructed concealment. Keep looking. Eastern ridge, 800 meters out. Those rock formations near the peak." Reeves moved his scope to the new location. The rocky outcroppings looked natural, the kind of geological features that existed throughout this mountain region. Granite and limestone formations carved by thousands of years of wind and water, creating irregular shapes and shadow pockets that provided natural cover for wildlife. Except, Kiera had been studying these ridges for 3 days during mission preparation. She'd memorized their shapes, their positions, the way they caught light at different times of day. And now, seeing them with morning sun at a different angle, she noticed variations that hadn't been there in the satellite imagery, small variations. A rock formation that seemed slightly taller than she remembered. A shadow pocket that appeared deeper than it should be. And near the base of one outcropping, vegetation that grew in a pattern too regular to be natural, like it had been placed rather than grown. "Those positions have been improved," Reeves said, his voice carrying a note of concern that hadn't been there before. "Someone's been working that terrain, recently." "How recently?" "Vegetation's still green. Weather patterns here, anything cut and placed would brown out in 72 hours. This was done within the last 2 days. Maybe yesterday." Which meant it had happened after the final intelligence update. After the satellite passes that had cleared the valley as safe. After the decision had been made to send 520 soldiers into terrain that someone else had been preparing for a very different purpose. Kiera continued her scan, moving to the creek bed that ran through the center of the valley. The natural water source that tactical planning had identified as a key terrain feature. Soldiers would need water. And the creek provided easy access while offering some concealment from elevated observation. The creek bed was approximately 2 meters deep, with sandy banks that showed erosion patterns from seasonal flooding. Vegetation grew thicker near the water brush and small trees that thrived on the moisture. Perfect natural cover for troops who needed to move under concealment. Except the vegetation pattern was wrong too. Kiera had grown up reading landscapes. Her father had taught her that plants grew according to predictable patterns, based on water availability, sunlight exposure, soil conditions. Willows clustered near water sources. Desert scrub favored dry, elevated ground. Each species had preferences that created natural distributions you could identify if you knew what to look for. The brush along this creek bed wasn't distributed naturally. There were clusters of growth in locations that didn't make hydrological sense. Thick vegetation in spots where the creek bank was too steep for root systems to establish. Sparse growth in areas where water and sunlight should have produced dense cover. She studied those irregular clusters more carefully, adjusting her scope's magnification to maximum. The vegetation wasn't wrong, it was camouflage. Cut branches and transplanted brush positioned to conceal something underneath. And beneath one cluster, she saw it clearly, the dark rectangular outline of a spider hole entrance. Perfectly positioned to provide cover and concealment for fighters who could emerge directly into the flank of anyone moving along the creek bed. "They've prepared the entire valley," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made Reeves look at her sharply. "Village positions, ridge positions, creek bed positions. This isn't an opportunistic ambush. This is a planned kill zone." Reeves felt cold spread through his chest despite the climbing temperature. "Command needs to know. We need to call this in now." Kiera was already reaching for her radio when battalion net traffic exploded with calm professional communication. Bravo Battalion had reached their primary positions and was beginning defensive establishment. Company commanders were checking in with status reports. "Everything proceeding on schedule," she keyed her handset. "Overwatch 7-3 to Battalion Tactical Operations Center, priority traffic." There was a brief pause, then a response from the TALK battle captain. 7-3, this is TALK. Send your traffic. TALK. Be advised we have observed indicators of prepared defensive positions throughout the valley. Multiple locations including the restricted village area, eastern ridgeline, and creek bed terrain. Recommend immediate halt of battalion movement until intelligence can reassess. Another pause, longer this time. She could picture the scene in the TALK officers gathered around digital displays, looking at the same satellite imagery that had cleared this operation. A sniper team calling in a priority report that contradicted days of intelligence analysis and planning. 7-3 talk. Clarify your indicators. What specifically are you observing? Kiera described what she'd seen: the constructed concealment in the village buildings, the improved positions on the ridgeline, the irregular vegetation patterns along the creek bed. She kept her language technical, professional, avoiding the subjective assessment that this was a trap. Just reporting observable facts that suggested human activity in areas intelligence had classified as clear. The response came from a different voice, this time deeper, carrying more authority. Major Douglas Whitmore, the battalion operations officer. A career infantry officer who'd spent 20 years trusting intelligence assessments and digital analysis tools. 7-3, this is the OC actual. Your report is noted. However, current intelligence assessment based on comprehensive surveillance indicates minimal threat. The features you're describing could be explained by natural variation in terrain, observation under different lighting conditions. Battalion will continue mission as planned. Maintain your observation position and report any actual hostile activity. TOC out. Reeves looked at Kiera. Her jaw was tight, her eyes still pressed to her scope. Scanning the valley where 520 soldiers were spreading out into positions that would become death traps the moment someone decided to spring the ambush. They're not listening. Reeves said, I know, so what do we do? Kiera didn't answer immediately. She continued her scan, cataloging every prepared position she could identify. The village buildings with their constructed concealment. She counted 6 positions that could hold fighters with clear fields of fire into the valley center. The ridgeline positions, at least 4 improved locations that would provide elevated, firing positions with interlocking coverage. The spider holes along the creek bed, she'd identified 3 entrances, which likely meant there were more she couldn't see from her angle. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a sophisticated tactical operation that had required significant planning, preparation, and coordination. Someone had studied this valley the same way she was studying it now, had identified all the key terrain, all the natural advantages, all the positions where defenders could inflict maximum casualties on an attacking force. Except, Bravo Battalion wasn't attacking. They were moving into defensive positions, which meant they'd be stationary, predictable, focused on establishing their perimeter rather than watching for threats from positions intelligence said didn't exist. We need to identify the command element, Kiera said. Whoever's running this operation, they're coordinating from somewhere. Find them, and we can disrupt the whole system. Reeves shifted his spotting scope, beginning a systematic scan of the elevated terrain surrounding the valley, looking for observation posts with radio capability. Someone who can see the whole battlefield. They searched in professional silence, both of them aware that time was compressing. Bravo Battalion was fully committed now. Their vehicles parked in tactical formations. Their soldiers digging fighting positions. Their heavy weapons teams setting up crew-served weapons that would be excellent for defensive fire but useless if the threat came from positions they hadn't identified. That's when Kiera saw him, 900 meters from her position, on a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. A single figure stood in a position that provided perfect observation of everything happening below. He wasn't hiding, didn't need to, because he was far enough away that Bravo Battalion soldiers would never notice him without optical magnification. He held a radio handset, and as Kiera watched, he made a series of hand signals to positions she couldn't see. He was directing the ambush, coordinating the fighters who waited in those prepared positions. And he was doing it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how this would unfold, who had planned every detail, who was waiting for the perfect moment to give the order that would turn Kandara Valley into a killing field. Kiera centered her crosshairs on his chest. Range, 900 meters. Wind, 3 kilometers per hour, left to right. Elevation, 43 meters above target position. Temperature, climbing through 22 degrees Celsius. All factors she could calculate, adjust for, compensate in her firing solution. One shot. That's all it would take. Remove the command element, and the coordinated ambush would collapse into chaos. Give Bravo Battalion the seconds they needed to identify threats and return fire. Save lives by taking one, but she had orders. Do not engage unless Bravo Battalion comes under direct fire. Rules of engagement that made sense for peacekeeping operations, but became suicide pacts. When intelligence was wrong, her finger rested beside the trigger. Not on it, not yet. And in the valley below, 520 soldiers continued establishing their defensive perimeter, completely unaware that they were walking into a trap that would kill most of them in the next 15 minutes. The temperature continued climbing as the sun reached its full strength. Heat waves began rising from the valley floor, creating shimmer effects that would make long-range shooting more complicated. Kiera felt sweat forming along her hairline, soaking into the band of her boonie cap, but she didn't move to wipe it away. Movement meant losing her sight picture, and right now that sight picture was the only thing standing between observation and action. In the valley below, Bravo Battalion had nearly completed their defensive establishment. Fighting positions were dug, fields of fire marked with range stakes, communication wires strung between command posts. Captain Brennan stood near his tactical operations center, reviewing a map board with his executive officer while radio operators maintained contact with higher headquarters. It looked professional. It looked ready. It looked exactly like what a well-trained infantry battalion should look like when establishing a defensive perimeter in permissive terrain, except the terrain wasn't permissive. And every second that passed brought them closer to the moment when that reality would become undeniable. Kiera's radio crackled with routine traffic. Other sniper teams checking in from their positions, reporting negative contact, confirming observation sectors. The weather report was updated: storm system still approaching, extraction window narrowing. In 2 hours, visibility would deteriorate significantly. In 4 hours, helicopter operations would become dangerous. She keyed her handset again. Talk, this is Overwatch 7-3. Request immediate communication with battalion commander. The response came quickly, but the tone carried irritation. 7-3, talk. Battalion commander is engaged with perimeter establishment. State the nature of your request. Talk. I need to speak directly with the commander regarding tactical situation in the valley. This cannot wait for routine reporting channels. There was a longer pause this time. She could imagine the debate happening in that operations center. A lieutenant sniper calling for direct access to a battalion commander, bypassing the entire chain of command, insisting on priority communication based on observations that contradicted established intelligence. Major Whitmore's voice came back on the radio, and this time the irritation was clear. 7-3, this is the OC Actual. I've reviewed your previous report. Current intelligence assessment remains unchanged. Unless you have observed actual hostile forces preparing to engage, you will maintain your assigned observation position and report through normal channels. We do not interrupt the commander's tactical decision-making based on terrain interpretation that contradicts comprehensive intelligence analysis. Do you have actual hostile forces in sight? Yes or no? Kiera looked through her scope at the figure on the distant ridge. The man coordinating the ambush. The command element controlling positions throughout the valley. He was there. She could see him clearly. But until he gave the order to open fire, until the first shots were fired at Bravo Battalion, he was just a person standing on a ridge in territory that intelligence said was friendly. Negative actual hostile forces engaging at this time, she said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. Then maintain your position and report any changes. TOC out. The radio went silent. Reeves lowered his spotting scope and looked at her. His expression said everything he was thinking without needing to vocalize it. They both knew what was about to happen. They both understood that protocol and rules of engagement were about to get 520 soldiers killed. "We could fire a warning shot," Reeves said quietly. "Put a round into the dirt near that commander's position. Make them think they're under fire from a different direction. Create confusion that might delay the ambush. And violate rules of engagement in a way that would end both our careers and potentially create an international incident." Kiera replied, "If intelligence is wrong about the threat, they might also be wrong about who controls this territory. That warning shot could start a war. Better than watching a massacre, is it? Are you sure?" "Because I'm not." She wasn't being difficult. She was working through the same calculations that every soldier faced when orders contradicted reality. The military functioned on discipline and chain of command. You followed orders even when you disagreed with them, because the person giving those orders presumably had information you didn't. They saw the bigger picture. They understood strategic implications that a lieutenant on a ridge couldn't possibly comprehend. But sometimes the person on the ground saw things the person giving orders couldn't see. Sometimes the bigger picture missed critical details that would get people killed. And sometimes following orders meant standing by while preventable disasters unfolded. That her father had taught her about that too, though not in a military context. He'd told her about a time he was guiding hunters through the Bitterroot Mountains, when weather forecasts said conditions would remain clear. But he'd seen cloud formations that told a different story. Seen wind patterns that suggested a major storm system was approaching faster than. Meteorologists predicted that the hunters wanted to continue deeper into the wilderness. They'd paid for a week-long expedition and didn't want to cut it short based on one guide's concerns when official weather reports said everything was fine. Her father had faced a choice: follow the plan that everyone else thought was correct, or trust his own observations and risk looking foolish if the storm never materialized. He'd turned the expedition around, brought everyone back to base camp 6 hours before the storm hit with winds that would have killed them all if they'd been caught in the high country. The hunters had complained initially, had demanded refunds, had accused him of being overly cautious, until they saw the news reports about 3 other groups that hadn't turned back. Groups that had trusted the official forecasts and died. When the storm proved the forecasts wrong, Kiera thought about that story as she watched Bravo Battalion settling into positions that would become their graves. Thought about the difference between following rules and making the right choice. Thought about the fact that sometimes being right meant accepting consequences that would follow you for the rest of your life. Range to the command element? She asked Reeves. 900 meters. Winds picked up slightly 4 kilometers per hour, still left to right. Elevation angle 43 meters. Temperature 24 degrees. You'd need to adjust for the thermal layering that's building with the heat. Time of flight? At that range, approximately 1.2 seconds. She ran the calculations automatically, compensating for every variable that would affect the bullet's trajectory. Gravity drop, wind deflection, air density, Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation. All the factors that separated successful shots from misses at distances where the target would never hear the rifle report. Her finger moved to the trigger, not resting beside it anymore. Actually touching the curved metal, feeling the tension of the spring mechanism. Knowing exactly how much pressure would release the firing pin and send a round downrange at 2,800 feet per second. "Kiera," Reeves said softly, "once you pull that trigger, there's no walking it back. Command will court-martial you. Best case scenario, you lose your career. Worst case, you face charges for violating rules of engagement. I know. The soldiers down there won't even know you saved them. This won't be a ceremony with medals and speeches. You'll be the sniper who ignored orders and created a diplomatic incident. I know that too. So why are you even considering it? She didn't answer immediately. She was watching the valley through her scope, seeing patterns that kept confirming what her instincts had told her from the beginning. The abandoned village wasn't empty. She could see movement now in those carefully constructed positions. Slight shifts in shadow that meant people were there, waiting. The ridge positions showed similar signs, not obvious movement, but the small indicators that came from human presence. A reflection of sunlight off glass or metal. A change in the texture of shadows that suggested equipment, and most damning, the command element on the distant ridge had been joined by two other figures. They stood in a tight group, conferring, looking down at the valley where Bravo Battalion was exposed and vulnerable. One of them held binoculars. Another appeared to be speaking into a radio handset. They were coordinating, making final preparations, ensuring every element was in position before giving the order that would turn this valley into a killing zone. Kiera's breathing slowed. Her heart rate dropped into the controlled rhythm that came from years of training and dozens of real-world engagements. This was the state she entered before taking shots that mattered, the zone where time seemed to stretch, where irrelevant sensory input faded away, where nothing existed except the target and the solution. Estimate 5 minutes until they initiate, Reeves said, his voice tight. Maybe less. They're waiting for Bravo to be fully committed. Attention focused inward on their own perimeter. Maximum vulnerability. I see it. Orders say we don't engage. Orders also say we provide security overwatch for the battalion. Hard to provide security when we're watching them die because we followed bureaucratic protocol instead of tactical reality. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he adjusted his spotting scope, centering on the command element. If you're going to do this, I'm calling the shot. We do it right. That statement meant more than just providing technical support. It meant he was accepting joint responsibility for violating orders. It meant his career would end alongside hers if this went wrong. It meant he'd looked at the same situation and reached the same conclusion, that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting permanent consequences. Below them, Captain Brennan received a radio communication from battalion headquarters. Final confirmation that defensive establishment was complete, that all elements were in position, that the operation was proceeding exactly as planned. He acknowledged the transmission and turned to brief his company leadership on the timeline for the next phase of operations. He had no idea he was speaking to some of them for the last time. No idea that in less than 5 minutes, several of those officers would be dead and others would be fighting for their lives against an ambush that intelligence had said wasn't possible on the distant ridge. The command element made final adjustments. The man with binoculars scanned the valley one last time, verifying that all elements of Bravo Battalion were positioned exactly where he wanted them. The coordination was precise. He'd studied their doctrine, understood how American forces established defensive perimeters, knew exactly where they'd place their command posts in heavy weapons positions. He lowered the binoculars and reached for his radio handset. His hand moved with deliberate purpose, about to give the order that would initiate the ambush. And that's when Kiera made her decision. Not based on permission from command. Not based on rules of engagement written by officers who weren't watching this unfold in real time. Not based on concern for her career or fear of consequences. Based on 520 soldiers who were about to die because the system had failed them. Wind? She asked. 4.2 kilometers per hour, left to right. Reeves replied immediately, falling into the familiar rhythm of their partnership. Range 900 meters, elevation 43 meters above target. Temperature 24 degrees, climbing. Mirage is building. You'll need to favor the lower edge of your holdover to compensate for the thermal layer. Kiera made the final adjustments to her scope. Elevation turret clicks counted precisely. Windage compensation calculated and dialed in. Her breathing settled into the pattern, in through the nose, out through the mouth, finding the natural respiratory pause where her body was most stable. The crosshairs settled on the command element's chest. Center mass. The shot that offered the highest probability of immediate incapacitation. At this range, with these conditions, she had perhaps an 80% confidence in a first-round hit. Good enough for competition shooting. Barely acceptable for combat operations where the target would react immediately after the first shot, but it was the shot she had. And if she didn't take it in the next 10 seconds, she'd be watching 520 soldiers die while she did nothing. Her finger applied pressure to the trigger. Smooth, steady, increasing incrementally until she reached the breakpoint where the firing mechanism would release. "Send it," Reeves said quietly. The Barrett M82 roared. The recoil punched into Kiera's shoulder with familiar force. The massive .50 caliber round leaving the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's trajectory, not the bullet itself, which moved too fast to track visually, but the trace of disrupted air it left behind. The shimmer of supersonic passage cutting through the morning heat, 1.2 seconds. That's how long the round took to cross 900 meters of mountain air, dropping through calculated elevation, drifting slightly with the crosswind, following the parabolic arc that physics demanded. Time moved differently during those seconds, stretched and compressed simultaneously, long enough to question everything. Too short to take it back, the round struck the command element exactly where Kiera had aimed. Center mass, through the chest cavity. The man with the radio handset, the one who'd been coordinating the ambush, whose hand had been reaching to give the order, dropped instantly. Not the dramatic backward fall that movies portrayed, but the sudden collapse that came when the central nervous system received catastrophic trauma and simply shut down. The two men standing beside him froze for exactly half a second, their brains processing the impossible. One moment they were preparing to initiate a carefully planned ambush. The next, their commander was on the ground, and they were standing exposed on a ridgeline being targeted by someone they hadn't even known was there. That half second of confusion was exactly what Kiera needed. Target down. Reeves confirmed through his spotting scope. Secondary targets breaking left and right, moving for cover. Kiera was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. The Barrett's action cycled smoothly. Decades of design refinement resulting in a weapon system that could deliver devastating firepower with remarkable reliability. Her crosshairs found the second target, the man with binoculars, who was diving toward a rock formation. She led him by half a body length, accounting for his movement speed and direction. Squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared again. The second round caught him mid-dive. Impact energy transferring through his torso with enough force to change his trajectory. He hit the ground hard and didn't move. 2 shots, 2 targets eliminated in under 4 seconds. Combat shooting at a level that most snipers trained for, but few ever executed. Under real-world conditions, the third man had better survival instincts. He was already behind cover, completely concealed, probably on his radio calling for support, or trying to figure out where the shots had come from. Kiera scanned for any exposed portion, an elbow, a boot. Anything she could target, but he'd found good cover and wasn't making rookie mistakes. "Command element neutralized," she said. Her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Secondary coordinator is concealed, no shot available." That's when the valley exploded. Not with the coordinated ambush that had been planned. Instead, chaos erupted as fighters in prepared positions throughout the valley realized their command structure had just been decapitated. Some opened fire immediately, following whatever last instructions they'd received. Others hesitated, waiting for orders that would never come. The careful timing that would have turned this into a devastating synchronized attack dissolved into ragged, uncoordinated shooting. But even uncoordinated, it was still an ambush. and Bravo Battalion was still caught in a kill zone. The village positions opened up first. Rifle fire poured from those carefully concealed positions, targeting the western edge of Bravo's perimeter, where Alpha Company had established their fighting positions. Soldiers dove for cover, returning fire at muzzle flashes they could barely identify. Trying to understand where the threat was coming from when intelligence had said there was no threat, Captain Brennan's radio net exploded with traffic. Squad leaders calling in contact reports, trying to identify enemy positions, requesting permission to return fire, calling for medical evacuation for soldiers who'd been hit in the initial volley. The professional calm that had characterized the operation 15 seconds ago disintegrated into the controlled chaos that defined close-quarters combat. Contact, contact, contact. Northwest village structures. That was First Lieutenant Cross, her voice tight but controlled. Multiple shooters, small arms fire, requesting clearance to engage with heavy weapons. All units, this is Black Hawk 6, Brennan responded, his command voice cutting through the radio traffic. Clearance granted. Engage all hostile targets. Get those crew-served weapons into action. The ridge positions opened fire next, targeting Bravo's command post with precision that suggested they'd known exactly where it would be located. Rounds snapped through the air, forcing radio operators and staff officers to abandon their equipment and seek cover. One of the intelligence analysts, a young specialist, who'd briefed that the valley was clear just 3 hours ago, took a round through his shoulder and went down screaming. The expected devastation didn't happen. The carefully planned ambush that should have achieved surprise and overwhelming initial casualties instead turned into a firefight where Bravo Battalion, though caught off guard, had enough warning to react. Soldiers who'd been establishing defensive positions suddenly found themselves in actual defensive combat. But they were in cover, they had their weapons ready, and they had leadership that was still functional. Because Kiera had removed the command element. The coordinator who would have timed the attack perfectly, who would have controlled the fire discipline, who would have ensured that every position opened fire simultaneously to achieve maximum shock effect. He was dead before giving that order. Alpha Company is engaged heavy, northwest sector. Cross reported. Charlie Company, we need suppressive fire on those village positions. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's heavy weapons teams swung into action. M240 machine guns and M2 Browning .50 caliber positions that had been set up for defensive fire now poured rounds into the village structures. The superior firepower of American crew-served weapons began to make a difference, suppressing the ambush positions, forcing the fighters to keep their heads down instead of maintaining aimed fire. Kiera continued working. Her role had shifted from observer to active participant, and she embraced it completely. Through her scope, she identified targets that Bravo Battalion couldn't see from their positions on the valley. Floor shooters on the ridgeline. Fighters moving between positions in the village. Anyone trying to coordinate or maneuver. Ridgeline. Center position, shooter with RPG, Reeves called out, his spotting scope tracking the figure that appeared briefly near the rocks. Kiera's crosshairs found him. Range, 750 meters. Wind, still 4 kilometers per hour. Elevation, 31 meters above target. The fighter was trying to get into position to engage one of Bravo's armored vehicles. An RPG hit could disable the vehicle, potentially kill the crew, eliminate a valuable asset that was providing mobile fire support. She fired. The round struck home. The RPG operator dropped, his weapon falling uselessly beside him. Target down, Reeves confirmed. Multiple targets moving in the village. Looks like they're trying to reposition. I see them. She engaged 3 more targets in rapid succession. Each shot was a calculated decision, not just whether she could hit the target, but whether that target represented a significant enough threat to justify the ammunition expenditure and the attention it would draw to her position. She wasn't trying to kill everyone in the valley. She was trying to disrupt coordination, eliminate high-value targets, create confusion that would give Bravo Battalion the advantage they needed to survive. The spider holes along the creek bed had been designed to attack soldiers who sought cover near the water. But without coordinated timing, the fighters emerging from those positions found themselves exposed to fire from Bravo's heavy weapons positions. Mitchell's gunners identified them quickly, adjusted their fire, and systematically engaged each position as it revealed itself. In the Tactical Operations Center, Major Whitmore was processing information that contradicted everything he believed 15 minutes ago. The valley that intelligence had cleared as safe was actually a prepared ambush site. The contractor village that engineers had said was structurally unsound was actually a fortified position. And somehow, despite all of that, Bravo Battalion was winning the firefight. "Get me Overwatch 7-3, he ordered one of the radio operators. The connection came through immediately. 7-3, this is DOC Actual. Report your status and engagement authority." Kiera continued scanning for targets while she replied, "TOC, 7-3 is engaged. Currently providing precision fire support against hostile positions that were coordinating the ambush. Command element neutralized at 0847 hours, multiple follow-on targets engaged." There was a pause. She could imagine Whitmore's face as he processed what she'd just said. She'd engaged targets before Bravo Battalion had come under fire, which meant she'd violated rules of engagement, which meant she'd opened fire without authorization in a way that could have international repercussions. But it also meant she'd saved 520 soldiers from an ambush that would have killed dozens and wounded hundreds more. "Understood," Whitmore said, his voice carefully neutral. "Continue providing fire support. We'll address the engagement timeline after extraction. Good shooting, 7-3. That was as close to approval as she was going to get over an open radio frequency. The real conversation would come later, in offices where lawyers and commanders would review every decision, every shot, every choice she'd made. But for now, she had implicit authorization to continue doing exactly what she'd been doing, keeping Bravo Battalion alive. Reeves was tracking movement near the northern edge of the village. Multiple targets retreating from village positions. They're breaking contact, moving northeast toward the ridgeline. Kiera observed the movement through her scope. The ambush had failed. Without coordination, without their commander, without the surprise they'd counted on, the fighters were making the tactical decision to withdraw rather than be systematically destroyed by superior American firepower. It was the smart choice: live to fight another day rather than die in a position that no longer offered any advantage. She could have engaged them, could have taken shots at retreating targets, inflicted additional casualties, maybe prevented them from regrouping somewhere else. But that wasn't her mission. Her mission was protecting Bravo Battalion, and the fighters withdrawing northeast weren't a threat anymore. "Let them go," she said. "Focus on anyone still engaging our positions." The firefight continued for another 12 minutes, but the intensity decreased steadily. The village positions fell silent as the last fighters either died or withdrew. The ridge positions stopped firing once they realized they were being systematically targeted by a sniper they couldn't locate. The spider holes along the creek bed were cleared by Bravo's infantry squads, who approached with the caution of soldiers who just learned that intelligence assessments could be catastrophically wrong. By 0910 hours, Kandara Valley was quiet again. The only sounds were radio traffic coordinating casualty evacuation, the distant rumble of helicopter rotors as medical birds inbound from the FOB, and the occasional crack of shots as clearing teams made sure abandoned positions were actually abandoned. Captain Brennan stood near his Tactical Operations Center, looking at the map that showed engagement areas, casualty locations, and the positions where fighters had been identified. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his uniform torn where he dove for cover during the initial contact. But he was alive. His soldiers were alive. The casualties they'd taken, 7 wounded. None killed, were manageable rather than catastrophic. He picked up his radio handset. "Talk, this is Black Hawk 6. Request direct communication with Overwatch 7-3. The connection patched through after a few seconds. 7-3, you're connected with Black Hawk 6. 7-3, this is Captain Brennan. I need you to know something." His voice was steady, professional, but carried an edge of emotion that came from looking at his soldiers and realizing how close they'd come to dying. Intelligence was wrong. Command was wrong. And you were right. Thank you for ignoring us. Kiera looked through her scope at the valley below. At the soldiers who were alive, because she'd made a choice that would follow her for the rest of her career. "Just doing my job." "Sir," she replied, but they both knew it was more than that. It was the moment when following orders and doing the right thing had diverged completely. And she'd chosen the right thing, knowing exactly what it would cost. The storm system was moving in faster now. Dark clouds building over the peaks. Wind picking up, the first drops of rain beginning. To fall on a valley where 520 soldiers had just learned that. Sometimes survival depends on someone willing to break the rules that everyone else follows. Extraction helicopters arrived 30 minutes after the firefight ended, their rotors beating against increasingly hostile weather. Black Hawks descended into the valley with practiced precision, crews already prepared for casualty evacuation. The 7 wounded soldiers were loaded first, medical personnel working efficiently despite the approaching storm. None of the injuries were life-threatening, through a combination of good training, decent cover, and the disrupted ambush timing, but they all required treatment beyond what field medics could provide. Kiera and Reeves remained on their ridge position, watching the extraction unfold below while maintaining security overwatch. The storm clouds now dominated the western sky, dark and pregnant with rain that would turn the valley's dirt roads into impassable mud within hours. Wind gusts were picking up strength, making long-range shooting increasingly difficult. Not that it mattered anymore, the threat had withdrawn, and Bravo Battalion was consolidating for their own extraction. "Command wants us at FOB Sentinel immediately upon return," Reeves said, reading a message that had come through on their encrypted tactical radio. "Report directly to the battalion commander's office. Do not discuss the engagement with anyone else." Kiera had expected as much. The moment she'd pulled that trigger, she'd set in motion a series of administrative and legal processes that would dissect every aspect of her decision. There would be investigations, formal statements, reviews by officers who hadn't been there, and lawyers who'd never been in combat. The machinery of military justice moved slowly but thoroughly, especially when someone violated rules of engagement in ways that could have strategic implications. She began breaking down her rifle, performing the functions check that ensured the weapon was clear and safe before movement. Bolt open, chamber inspected, magazine removed. The Barrett was cleaned and stowed with the same methodical precision she'd used to employ it. Each piece of equipment packed carefully, nothing left behind that could compromise their position or capabilities. The flight back to FOB Sentinel was tense and quiet. The helicopter crew knew something significant had happened. You didn't conduct emergency extractions under deteriorating weather conditions for routine operations. But they asked no questions, maintaining professional focus on flying through increasingly difficult conditions. The Black Hawk bucked and swayed as wind currents hit it, the pilots fighting to maintain stable flight while rain began hammering against the windscreen. They landed at FOB Sentinel just as the storm fully arrived. Sheets of rain turning the landing zone into a muddy chaos of running personnel and equipment being hastily secured. Kiera and Reeves moved quickly from the helicopter to the operations building, their gear heavy with water, boots squelching in the mud. Sergeant Major Thomas Ashford was waiting for them at the entrance. He was a 30-year veteran with 4 combat deployments and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything the military could throw at soldiers. His expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about what was coming. "Lieutenant Halstead, Corporal Reeves," he said formally. "The battalion commander will see you immediately. Leave your weapons and tactical gear here. This is an administrative meeting, not a tactical debrief." That distinction was significant. Tactical debriefs happened with full gear, often while still dirty from the field, focused on what happened and why. Administrative meetings happened in offices with lawyers present, focused on whether rules had been followed and what consequences would follow if they hadn't. They secured their equipment in the arms room and followed Ashford through corridors that smelled of wet concrete and industrial coffee. Soldiers moved aside as they passed, some curious about what was happening, others deliberately looking away because they'd already heard rumors about the operation in Kandara Valley. The battalion commander's office was on the 2nd floor of the operations building. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kimball had commanded the 2nd Infantry Regiment for 18 months, and her reputation was built on 2 foundations. She cared intensely about her soldiers' welfare, and she had 0 tolerance for violations of military protocol. Those 2 principles didn't always coexist comfortably, and Kiera suspected they were about to collide directly. Also present in the office were Major Whitmore, the operations officer she'd argued with over the radio, Captain Helena Frost, the battalion's legal advisor, and another officer Kiera didn't recognize, an older colonel with insignia, suggesting he was from division headquarters. Colonel Kimball gestured to 2 chairs, positioned in front of her desk. "Lieutenant Halstead, Corporal Reeves, please sit." The formality was deliberate. This wasn't a conversation between soldiers who'd just been through combat. This was an official inquiry beginning. "I'm Colonel Kimball, your battalion commander. You've met Major Whitmore. This is Captain Frost, our legal advisor, and Colonel Raymond Pierce from division headquarters. He's here observing on behalf of the commanding general." She paused, organizing the papers in front of her. "Before we begin, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded and may be used in subsequent legal or administrative proceedings. You have the right to request counsel before answering any questions. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Kiera replied. Reeves echoed the response. "Do you wish to request counsel at this time?" Kiera considered it. Having a lawyer present would provide protection, ensure her rights were preserved, prevent her from saying anything that could be used against her later. But it would also signal that she viewed this as an adversarial process, that she was preparing for a fight rather than explaining her actions. "No, ma'am. I'm prepared to answer questions." Kimball nodded. "Very well. Let's start with the basic timeline. At approximately 0847 hours this morning, you engaged targets with your sniper rifle. According to preliminary reports, you fired at least 5 rounds, resulting in multiple casualties among personnel who were subsequently identified as hostile forces. Is that accurate?" "Yes, ma'am. At the time you engaged those targets, Bravo Battalion had not yet come under fire. Is that correct?" "That's correct, ma'am. So you violated rules of engagement that specifically prohibited firing unless friendly forces were under direct attack." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Kiera met the colonel's gaze directly. "Yes, ma'am, I violated the stated rules of engagement." Captain Frost made a note on her legal pad. Colonel Pierce leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Major Whitmore looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation that had too many variables. Kimball continued. "Help me understand your decision-making process. You observed what you believed were prepared fighting positions. You reported those observations to the Tactical Operations Center. You were told that intelligence assessment indicated minimal threat and that you should maintain observation. At that point, why didn't you follow those instructions?" This was the critical question. The one that would determine whether she'd made a tactical decision in good faith or simply decided she knew better than everyone in her chain of command. Kiera chose her words carefully. Ma'am, I assessed that the intelligence analysis was based on satellite imagery and electronic surveillance that hadn't detected the physical evidence. I was observing directly. The prepared positions weren't theoretical. I could see them with my own eyes. The constructed concealment in the village buildings. The improved fighting positions on the ridgeline. The spider holes along the creek bed. All of it indicated recent preparation by a force that understood our tactics and was positioning to exploit our vulnerabilities. But you're not an intelligence analyst, Whitmore interjected. You're a sniper. How could you be certain that what you were seeing actually represented hostile intent rather than, as I suggested, natural terrain variation under different lighting conditions? Because I grew up reading terrain, sir. Because I've spent 6 years learning to identify things that don't belong in natural landscapes. And because I saw the command element coordinating the ambush before it was initiated. That got everyone's attention. Kimball leaned forward. Explain what you saw. At approximately 0845 hours, one identified 3 individuals on an elevated position approximately 900 meters from my location. One was holding binoculars and scanning Bravo Battalion's positions. Another was holding a radio handset. The third appeared to be providing security. Their positioning gave them observation of the entire valley. Their behavior, the way they were checking positions. The timing of their radio communications indicated they were coordinating elements throughout the valley. You couldn't hear their radio communications, Frost pointed out. You couldn't know what they were saying. No, ma'am, but I could see the pattern. Scan the valley, make a radio call, receive a response, check a specific location. That's coordination. That's command and control. And at 0846 hours, the individual with the radio handset reached to make what I assessed would be the order to initiate the ambush. Assessed, Pierce said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried weight. Not new. Not confirmed. Assessed, based on your interpretation of body language and positioning. Yes, sir. And on that assessment, Kimball nodded. Very well. Let's start with the basic timeline. At approximately 0847 hours this morning, you engaged targets with your sniper rifle. According to preliminary reports, you fired at least 5 rounds, resulting in multiple casualties among personnel who were subsequently identified as hostile forces. Is that accurate? Yes, ma'am. At the time you engaged those targets, Bravo Battalion had not yet come under fire. Is that correct? That's correct, ma'am. So you violated rules of engagement that specifically prohibited firing unless friendly forces were under direct attack. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Kiera met the colonel's gaze directly. Yes, ma'am, I violated the stated rules of engagement. Captain Frost made a note on her legal pad. Colonel Pierce leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Major Whitmore looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation that had too many variables. Kimball continued. Help me understand your decision-making process. You observed what you believed were prepared fighting positions. You reported those observations to the Tactical Operations Center. You were told that intelligence assessment indicated minimal threat and that you should maintain observation. At that point, why didn't you follow those instructions? This was the critical question. The one that would determine whether she'd made a tactical decision in good faith or simply decided she knew better than everyone in her chain of command. Kiera chose her words carefully. Ma'am, I assessed that the intelligence analysis was based on satellite imagery and electronic surveillance that hadn't detected the physical evidence. I was observing directly. The prepared positions weren't theoretical. I could see them with my own eyes. The constructed concealment in the village buildings. The improved fighting positions on the ridgeline. The spider holes along the creek bed. All of it indicated recent preparation by a force that understood our tactics and was positioning to exploit our vulnerabilities. But you're not an intelligence analyst, Whitmore interjected. You're a sniper. How could you be certain that what you were seeing actually represented hostile intent rather than, as I suggested, natural terrain variation under different lighting conditions? Because I grew up reading terrain, sir. Because I've spent 6 years learning to identify things that don't belong in natural landscapes. And because I saw the command element coordinating the ambush before it was initiated. That got everyone's attention. Kimball leaned forward. Explain what you saw. At approximately 0845 hours, one identified 3 individuals on an elevated position approximately 900 meters from my location. One was holding binoculars and scanning Bravo Battalion's positions. Another was holding a radio handset. The third appeared to be providing security. Their positioning gave them observation of the entire valley. Their behavior, the way they were checking positions. The timing of their radio communications indicated they were coordinating elements throughout the valley. You couldn't hear their radio communications, Frost pointed out. You couldn't know what they were saying. No, ma'am, but I could see the pattern. Scan the valley, make a radio call, receive a response, check a specific location. That's coordination. That's command and control. And at 0846 hours, the individual with the radio handset reached to make what I assessed would be the order to initiate the ambush. Assessed, Pierce said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried weight. Not new. Not confirmed. Assessed, based on your interpretation of body language and positioning. Yes, sir. And on that assessment, you chose to engage. Knowing you were violating rules of engagement, knowing you could be wrong. Knowing that if you were wrong, you might kill innocent civilians and create an international incident. Kiera felt the weight of that statement. Because he was right, she'd made a decision based on assessment, not certainty. She'd been confident, but confidence wasn't proof. And if she'd been wrong, if those 3 men had been innocent civilians, if the positions throughout the valley had been something other than prepared ambush sites, she would have committed murder. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I made that decision knowing all of those possibilities. The room was silent except for rain hammering against the windows. The storm had fully arrived, turning afternoon into premature darkness, the kind of weather that grounded aircraft and made operations impossible. Kimball finally broke the silence. 520 soldiers came home from Kandara Valley today. 7 wounded, none killed. Captain Brennan's after-action report indicates that the ambush was disrupted specifically because their command element was eliminated before they could coordinate the attack. His assessment is that if the ambush had proceeded as planned, his battalion would have suffered at least 40 Kier and more than 100 wounded in the first 3 minutes of. The administrative quarters assigned to Kiera were stark and functional, a single room with a metal bed frame, a desk, a chair, and a window that looked out over the motor pool where mechanics worked on vehicles damaged during the Kandara Valley operation. She spent the first 3 days writing her statement, documenting every detail from the moment she'd arrived at Ridge 7-3 until the extraction helicopters had departed. Each observation, each calculation, each decision recorded with the precision that lawyers and review boards would scrutinize for months. Reeves was housed in a similar room 2 doors down. They were permitted to speak with each other about the incident since they'd both been present, but conversations with other personnel were restricted to administrative necessities. The isolation was deliberate, preventing them from influencing potential witnesses or coordinating stories that might obscure what had actually happened. On the 4th day, Kiera was summoned to the base conference room where the formal investigation team had established operations. The team consisted of 3 officers from division headquarters, none of whom had been involved in the Kandara Valley operation. Their job was to collect facts without the bias that came from having made decisions that might be called into question, The lead investigator was Major Patricia Henning, a military intelligence officer with 15 years of experience analyzing operations that had gone wrong. She sat across from Kiera at a conference table covered with maps, photographs, and documents. "Lieutenant Halstead, I've read your written statement. It's thorough and well documented. Now I'd like to walk through some specific aspects of your observations." She spread a satellite image of Kandara Valley across the table. "This is the imagery that intelligence analysts used to clear the valley for the operation. Can you show me what you saw that they missed?" Kiera studied the image. From above, the valley looked exactly as intelligence had described it: abandoned village with collapsed structures. Natural terrain features, vegetation growth consistent with an area that hadn't seen significant human activity. Nothing obviously threatening. The problem with satellite imagery is that it shows what exists, but not necessarily why it exists, Kiera said. She pointed to the village structures. "These buildings show roof collapse and wall deterioration. But the pattern of collapse is too uniform. Natural structural failure from weather and time produces random degradation. These buildings show consistent damage that maintains clear sight lines into the valley center. That's engineered concealment, not natural decay." Henning made notes. "And you determined this based on visual observation through your rifle scope, based on understanding how structures fail naturally versus how they're modified deliberately. I grew up in areas with abandoned buildings. I know what genuine neglect looks like. Show me the ridge positions." Kiera moved her finger to the eastern ridgeline. "These rock formations appear natural in satellite imagery. But when observed from a lateral angle with morning sun, the shadows reveal modified depth. Natural erosion creates irregular cavities. These positions showed geometric regularity that indicated human improvement rocks were positioned to create firing ports while maintaining the appearance of natural terrain. How could you distinguish that from ground level when satellites couldn't detect it from above?" "Because I was observing at a different angle with different lighting conditions. Satellite passes occur at specific times. Someone preparing these positions would work between those passes and position concealment to defeat overhead observation while remaining vulnerable to lateral scrutiny." Henning cross-referenced notes from the intelligence failure investigation. "Our analysts have since confirmed your observations. Ground reconnaissance found exactly what you described: improved positions designed to defeat satellite surveillance." Which raises the question, why didn't our intelligence analysts consider that possibility? Because they were analyzing data, not terrain. They looked at images and electronic signatures. They didn't consider that an adversary might understand our collection methods well enough to defeat them. The interview continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of Kiera's observations and decisions. Henning's questions were precise and occasionally skeptical, probing for inconsistencies or indications that Kiera had exaggerated her certainty after the fact. But the satellite imagery, the ground reconnaissance conducted after the battle, and the physical evidence all corroborated what she'd reported seeing. On the 7th day, Captain Brennan submitted a formal statement to the investigation team. Kiera wasn't present when he testified, but she heard about it afterward from Sergeant Major Ashford, who'd been in the room. Brennan had been unequivocal. He'd stated clearly that without Lieutenant Halstead's intervention, his battalion would have suffered catastrophic casualties. He'd described the ambush positions, the sophistication of the enemy coordination, the vulnerability of his forces. He'd also stated that he would have made the same decision she had if he'd been in her position, that protecting soldiers' lives outweighed adherence to rules of engagement when those rules were based on faulty intelligence. He'd ended his testimony with a formal recommendation that Kiera receive recognition for her actions rather than punishment. Similar statements came from other personnel. First Lieutenant Cross, who'd commanded the forward platoon, that had been hit hardest in the initial contact, testified that the disrupted timing of the ambush had given her soldiers crucial seconds to find cover and return fire. Staff Sergeant Mitchell stated that if the ambush had been fully coordinated, his heavy weapons positions would have been targeted simultaneously from multiple directions and likely destroyed before they could respond effectively. Even Major Whitmore, who dismissed Kiera's initial warnings, provided testimony that was surprisingly supportive. He acknowledged that his decision to override her concerns had been based on confidence in intelligence assessments that proved incorrect. He stated that while he couldn't condone violation of rules of engagement as standard practice, he understood why she'd felt compelled to act, and he believed her judgment had been sound given the information available to her at the time. The investigation expanded beyond just Kiera's actions. Intelligence analysts were questioned about their methodology, about why they'd missed obvious indicators of enemy preparation, about whether their processes needed revision. The satellite surveillance schedule was examined. Investigators discovered that the valley had been prepared during a 72-hour gap between collection passes. Exactly as Kiera had theorized, communications intercepts were analyzed. The enemy command element she'd eliminated was identified through fingerprints and facial recognition as a former military officer with extensive tactical training. His presence in the region had been noted by intelligence weeks earlier, but analysts had assessed him as a low-level militia coordinator rather than someone capable of planning sophisticated ambush operations. On the 10th day, Kiera was called back to Colonel Kimball's office. The same personnel were present: Kimball, Whitmore, Captain Frost, and Colonel Pierce. But the atmosphere was different. Less formal, less adversarial. "Lieutenant Halstead," Kimball began, "the investigation into the Kandara Valley operation has reached preliminary conclusions. I'm going to share those with you, though I must emphasize that final determinations haven't been made and won't be for several more weeks." She opened a folder. "The investigating team has concluded that your observations of enemy positions were accurate and that your assessment of the threat was reasonable given what you could observe from your position. They've also concluded that the intelligence failure was systemic. Multiple levels of analysis missed indicators that should have been detected. You were correct, and command was wrong." Kiera felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Vindication on the facts, at least. "However," Kimball continued, and that single word carried weight, "the team has also concluded that you violated rules of engagement in a manner that could have had serious consequences if your assessment had been incorrect. You made a unilateral decision to engage targets without authorization. And while that decision ultimately proved correct, it established a precedent that could be problematic if other soldiers felt empowered to similarly override command authority." Pierce spoke up. "The military functions on discipline and adherence to lawful orders. What you did was both necessary and problematic. Necessary because you saved lives. Problematic because we can't have a force where every soldier decides independently when orders apply to them." "So what happens now?" Kiera asked. "That's still being determined at levels above this battalion," Kimball replied. "But I can tell you what I've recommended. I've recommended that no punitive action be taken against you. I've also recommended that you receive formal recognition for actions that prevented catastrophic casualties to friendly forces. And I've recommended that your case be used to develop revised training and procedures for situations where ground observation contradicts intelligence assessments. You're turning this into a teaching moment," Kiera sighed. "More than that. We're using it to fix a broken system. The intelligence community is already revising their collection and analysis procedures based on lessons learned from this operation. Rules of engagement are being reviewed to provide more flexibility for ground observers to report and respond to threats that don't match intelligence assessments. And sniper training programs are being updated to emphasize the importance of terrain analysis and independent tactical thinking. Whitmore added, "Your actions demonstrated a gap in our doctrine. We'd created a system where sensors and analysts made threat determinations, and soldiers on the ground were expected to simply execute based on those determinations. We didn't account for situations where the people with eyes on target might see things that satellites and computers missed. That's changing." Captain Frost closed her legal notepad. "From a legal perspective, I've concluded that while you technically violated rules of engagement, you did so under conditions of immediate threat to friendly forces and with reasonable belief that your actions were necessary to prevent imminent casualties. That's not quite the same as the self-defense standard that normally justifies engagement, but it's close enough that I don't believe prosecution would be appropriate or successful." Pierce stood. "Lieutenant, I've been asked by the division commander to convey his personal appreciation for your actions. He's also asked me to inform you that once this investigation concludes, you'll be reassigned to division headquarters as a senior sniper instructor. Your job will be teaching other snipers how to do exactly what you did: observe, analyze, and make informed decisions even when those decisions contradict established assessments." Kiera absorbed that information. Not punishment. Not even just vindication. Promotion to a position where her experience would be used to train others. It was more than she'd hoped for when she'd pulled that trigger on Ridge 7-3. "One more thing," Kimball said. "Captain Brennan has submitted paperwork recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor device. That recommendation is being supported up through the chain of command. I can't promise it will be approved. These things get scrutinized heavily, but I want you to know that the soldiers you saved are making sure your actions are recognized." After the meeting ended and Kiera walked back to her quarters, she passed groups of soldiers who'd returned from Kandara Valley. Some of them recognized her word had spread despite the restrictions on discussing the operation. A few nodded respectfully. Others offered quiet words of thanks. One young private stopped her directly. "Ma'am, I was with Alpha Company, 1st Platoon. We were the ones who got hit first when the shooting started." He was maybe 20 years old, his uniform still showing dust from the valley despite having been washed. "Lieutenant Cross told us what happened. Told us you saw what we couldn't see and did what needed doing, even though command said not to. I just wanted to say thank you for not letting us die, because someone sitting in an office was wrong about the intelligence." Kiera didn't know how to respond to that. She'd done what she'd thought was necessary. But having someone stand in front of her young, alive, going home to his family someday made the abstract calculation suddenly very real. "You're welcome," she said quietly. "Take care of yourself." The private saluted and continued on his way. Kiera watched him go, thinking about the 40 soldiers who would have died if she'd followed orders. 40 people with families, with futures, with lives that mattered beyond military statistics. She'd broken the rules to save them. And somehow, against everything she'd expected, the system was acknowledging that sometimes breaking the rules was exactly what needed to be done. 6 weeks after Kandara Valley, Kiera stood in a different kind of operations center. Not the tactical hub where commanders monitored real-time combat operations, but a training facility at division headquarters where doctrine was written and future soldiers were shaped. The walls displayed maps from historical operations, photographs of terrain analysis examples, and digital screens showing various surveillance technologies and their limitations. She was no longer Lieutenant Halstead, the sniper under investigation. She was now Lieutenant Halstead, the senior instructor, tasked with teaching the next generation of snipers something that couldn't be found in field manuals: how to trust their own observations even when everyone else said they were wrong. The classroom held 24 students, all of them experienced snipers pulled from various units for advanced training. They ranged from junior enlisted soldiers to senior NCOs, each bringing years of field experience and strong opinions about how reconnaissance and observation should be conducted. Teaching people who already considered themselves experts was always challenging. But Kiera had an advantage. She had a story they'd all heard about, and she'd lived through the consequences. Today we're discussing the intersection of intelligence analysis and ground truth, she began, standing at the front of the classroom without notes. Specifically, what happens when satellites, signals intelligence, and analytical assessment tell you one thing, but your own eyes tell you something different. How many of you have been in situations where the intelligence briefing didn't match what you saw on the ground? Every hand went up. That wasn't surprising. Every soldier who'd spent time in combat zones had experienced the gap between what headquarters believed was happening and what actually existed in reality. Keep your hands up if you reported those discrepancies through proper channels. About half the hands stayed up. Keep them up if your reports changed the operational plan or the intelligence assessment. 3 hands remained raised. 3 out of 24. The rest had experienced the same thing Kiera had, observing reality that contradicted official assessments, reporting it, and being told that the assessment was correct and their observations were mistaken or misinterpreted. That's the problem we're here to address, Kiera said. Not how to be better at following orders, but how to be better at making decisions when the orders are based on information you know is wrong. Because that's the situation I found myself in at Kandara Valley, and it's a situation every one of you will eventually face. She displayed satellite imagery of the valley on the main screen. The same images intelligence analysts had used to clear the operation. From the student's perspective, sitting in an air-conditioned classroom with no immediate pressure, the valley looked exactly as described: abandoned, quiet, permissive terrain. This is what command saw, she said. Now I'm going to show you what I saw. She pulled up her scope footage from that morning. She'd recorded brief clips through her optic, standard practice for documenting observations. The footage showed the village structures with their 2 uniform collapse patterns, the ridge positions with geometric shadows, the vegetation irregularities along the creek bed. Details that weren't obvious until you knew what to look for, but once identified, were impossible to unsee. The classroom was silent as students studied the comparison. Seeing both perspectives simultaneously made the intelligence failure obvious in a way that analyzing either source independently wouldn't have revealed. The analysts weren't incompetent, Kiera continued. They followed established procedures, used proven methodologies, applied their training correctly. But they were analyzing data through technological filters. They never considered that an adversary might understand our collection capabilities well enough to defeat them. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a limitation of any system that relies exclusively on technological surveillance. A staff sergeant in the front row raised his hand. Ma'am, with respect, we're taught that intelligence assessment is done by specialists with access to information we don't have. How are we supposed to know when our observations are more reliable than their analysis? You're not supposed to know with certainty, Kiera replied. That's the uncomfortable reality of ground reconnaissance. You're making judgment calls with incomplete information under time pressure. But here's what you can do. You can understand the difference between data and terrain. Data tells you what sensors detected. Terrain tells you what actually exists. When those 2 things contradict each other, you need to ask yourself which one you trust more and why. She walked to a topographical map mounted on the wall. Intelligence analysts told me the village buildings were structurally unsound from natural decay. But I'd grown up around abandoned structures. I'd seen what genuine neglect looked like versus deliberate modification. That knowledge didn't come from sniper training. It came from understanding how the physical world works. Every one of you has knowledge like that. expertise you've developed from life experience before you ever put on a uniform. The question is whether you're willing to trust that knowledge when it contradicts official assessments. Another student spoke up, this one a corporal who looked barely old enough to vote. But ma'am, you violated direct orders. Even if you were right, doesn't that set a bad precedent? If everyone just decides for themselves when orders apply, doesn't that break down discipline? It was the same question Colonel Pierce had raised, and it was a valid concern. Kiera had spent weeks thinking about how to answer it in a way that was honest without encouraging insubordination. Yes, I violated orders, she said. And yes, that's problematic. Military effectiveness depends on soldiers following lawful commands, even when they disagree with them. But it also depends on soldiers being able to think critically and respond to situations that commanders can't see from their positions. The balance between those two requirements is where leadership happens. She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. Here's what I want you to understand. I didn't break protocol because I thought I was smarter than everyone else. I broke it because I'd exhausted every other option. I reported my observations through proper channels. I requested direct communication with command. I explained exactly what I was seeing and why it mattered. And only when all of that failed, only when I was watching 520 soldiers walk into a kill zone and nobody with authority was listening, only then did I make the decision to engage. So the lesson is to try everything else first? The corporal asked. The lesson is to understand the difference between disagreeing with orders and recognizing when following orders will get people killed. Those are very different situations that require very different responses. Most of the time, you follow orders even when you disagree, because the person giving those orders has information and perspective you don't have. But occasionally, rarely, but it happens, you'll find yourself in a position where you have information they don't have, and following orders means people die unnecessarily. That's when you have to decide what kind of soldier you want to be. The training continued for 3 hours, covering terrain analysis techniques, intelligence collection limitations, communication protocols for reporting discrepancies, and decision-making frameworks for high-pressure situations. Kiera shared not just what she'd done right, but what she'd done wrong, the times she'd second-guessed herself, the moments she'd almost backed down, the fear that she was making a catastrophic mistake that would haunt her forever. When the formal instruction ended, several students remained to ask questions privately. They wanted to know about the investigation, about what happened afterward, about whether she'd truly been confident in her decision, or if doubt had crept in during those critical seconds. I was terrified I was wrong, she admitted to them. Right up until I pulled the trigger, part of my brain was screaming that I was about to murder 3 people based on my interpretation of shadows and vegetation patterns. That fear doesn't go away, but it also can't be the only factor in your decision-making. Sometimes you have to act despite the fear because the alternative is worse. The Bronze Star recommendation that Captain Brennan had submitted was approved 3 months after the operation. The awards ceremony was held at Division Headquarters with General Patricia Morrison, the division commander, presiding. Bravo Battalion sent a delegation of 50 soldiers, far more than normal for individual award ceremonies, including Captain Brennan, First Lieutenant Cross, and Staff Sergeant Mitchell. General Morrison read the citation aloud, describing Kiera's actions in language that was both laudatory and carefully worded. The citation acknowledged that she'd demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment and courage under conditions of ambiguous threat assessment, and that her decisive action prevented catastrophic casualties to friendly forces. It didn't explicitly mention that she'd violated orders. Official citations rarely included those details, but everyone present knew the full story when Morrison pinned the medal to Kiera's uniform. She added words that weren't part of the formal ceremony. What you did at Kandara Valley was both exactly right and deeply problematic. You saved lives by breaking rules, which means we need to examine why our rules created a situation where saving lives required breaking them. Thank you for having the courage to do what needed doing. And thank you for helping us learn from it. The soldiers from Bravo Battalion approached her afterward. Many of them people she'd never met, but who'd been in the valley that day. They shook her hand, thanked her quietly, shared stories about where they'd been when the shooting started, and how close they'd come to dying before the ambush timing collapsed. Several had photographs of families' wives, children, parents, people who would have received folded flags if Kiera had followed orders instead of her instincts. One sergeant, older than most of the others, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant First Class Nathan Cross. I was the senior NCO in the Battalion Tactical Operations Center when you called in your observations. I was one of the people who dismissed your report because it contradicted intelligence assessment." Kiera remembered the voice from the radio, though she hadn't known his name or rank at the time. "I need you to know something," Cross continued. "I've been doing this job for 16 years. I've participated in dozens of operations based on intelligence assessments that proved accurate. So when you reported observations that contradicted those assessments, my first instinct was to trust the system that had worked reliably in the past. I was wrong to do that. I was wrong to prioritize process over judgment. And I'm sorry that I put you in a position where you had to choose between following guidance from headquarters and protecting the soldiers in that valley. You were doing your job the way you'd been trained to do it," Kiera replied. "The system failed, not you personally. Maybe, but I learned something from it. I learned that experience and data aren't the same thing as wisdom. That sometimes the most important information comes from someone who's actually looking at the terrain, instead of looking at screens. I've changed how I handle reconnaissance reports because of what happened that day. When someone on the ground tells me they're seeing something that contradicts intelligence assessment, I take it seriously now instead of automatically deferring to the analysts." That conversation was repeated in various forms throughout the military over the following months. Kandara Valley became a case study taught at multiple levels of professional military education. Not just in sniper schools, but in intelligence courses, command and staff colleges, and officer basic training programs. The operation was analyzed from multiple perspectives: what intelligence failures had occurred and how could collection methodologies be improved, what communication breakdowns had prevented ground observations from reaching decision makers effectively, what doctrinal changes were needed to empower soldiers to report and respond to threats that didn't match established assessments. New protocols were developed. Intelligence analysts were required to include confidence levels in their assessments and acknowledge limitations in their collection coverage. Ground reconnaissance teams received enhanced training in terrain analysis and were given more authority to request operational holds based on observed discrepancies. Rules of engagement were revised to provide more flexibility for responding to threats in fluid situations where intelligence might be incomplete or incorrect. 1 year after Kandara Valley, Kiera received notification that she'd been selected for promotion to captain, ahead of her peers, a clear signal that despite the controversy surrounding her actions, the military valued what she'd demonstrated. The promotion ceremony was smaller than the medal ceremony, held at the training facility where she now worked full-time developing curriculum and instructing advanced reconnaissance courses. Colonel Kimball, who'd conducted the initial investigation, attended the ceremony. Afterward, she pulled Kiera aside for a private conversation. "I wanted you to know something that didn't make it into official reports," Kimball said. "When your case was being reviewed at division headquarters, there was significant debate about whether to recognize you or court-martial you. The legal arguments on both sides were strong. But what ultimately decided it was testimony from the soldiers you saved. Not from officers who were thinking about doctrine and precedent, but from privates and specialists who'd been digging fighting positions when the shooting started. They wrote letters. They called their congressional representatives. They made it clear that regardless of legal technicalities, they were alive because you'd refused to let bureaucracy get them killed. "I didn't do it for recognition," Kiera said. "I know. That's partly why you received it. But I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened at Kandara Valley changed more than just procedures and training programs. It changed how soldiers at every level think about the relationship between orders and judgment, between following protocol and doing what's right. That's a legacy that extends far beyond one operation." Kiera thought about that as she walked back to her office, where lesson plans for the next class cycle waited. She thought about the 24 students she'd taught that first day, who were now deployed to various locations around the world, carrying with them the lessons about trusting ground truth over technological data. She thought about the soldiers from Bravo Battalion who'd gone home to their families instead of being shipped home in flag-draped coffins. She thought about the moment on Ridge 7-3 when she'd made a decision that violated everything she'd been taught about military discipline, and how that single decision had rippled outward to change systems doctrine, and the way an entire generation of soldiers would approach similar situations in the future. The quiet ones do have stories. Sometimes those stories don't involve medals or recognition ceremonies. Sometimes they involve standing alone on a ridge, watching disaster unfold, and making the choice to prevent it, even when everyone with authority is telling you not to. And sometimes, if you're fortunate, the system eventually acknowledges that you were right, that your judgment mattered, that saving 520 lives was worth breaking the rules that would have let them die. Kiera sat down at her desk and opened the file for next month's advanced reconnaissance course. 28 new students, each bringing their own experiences and perspectives, each needing to learn the same uncomfortable lesson she'd learned that morning in Kandara Valley, that sometimes courage isn't about following orders. Sometimes it's about knowing when the orders are wrong and being willing to face the consequences of doing what needs to be done anyway. Outside her window, soldiers moved through their daily routines at division headquarters, training, preparing, getting ready for deployments that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Some of them would face situations like Kandara Valley, moments where protocol and reality diverged completely, and they have to choose which one mattered more. Kiera's job was to prepare them for those moments, to teach them not just how to shoot accurately at long distances, but how to think critically, trust their observations, communicate effectively, and make decisions that might save lives even if they ended careers. It was a different kind of mission than the one she'd trained for. But in its own way, it mattered just as much as anything she'd done on that ridge overlooking a valley where 520 soldiers had walked unknowingly toward death, because the next time a sniper saw something that contradicted intelligence assessments, the next time ground observations conflicted with official doctrine, the next time someone had to choose between following orders and saving lives, they have the example of Kandara Valley to guide them. They'd know that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones watching from elevated positions while everyone else focuses on the mission, see things that matter more than anyone realizes. And they'd know that trusting those observations, even when it means standing alone against the entire chain of command, is sometimes exactly what leadership requires. The sun was setting over the training facility, casting long shadows across the ranges where tomorrow's soldiers would practice the skills that might someday save lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Kiera saved her work, closed her files, and headed out into the evening air. Behind her, the legacy of one decision on one ridge, during one operation, continued spreading through a military, learning to balance discipline with judgment, protocol with wisdom, following orders with doing what's right. And somewhere in the world, 520 soldiers were living lives they wouldn't have lived if she'd made a different choice. That was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.